Thank you, Rich, for an overly generous introduction. What Rich left out there is that I picked him up that day in the hopes that he would pay for my lunch at the mall, and but the friendship did ensue, so it all worked out. Well, this is really exciting to have me. This is like a Heights back to school night, but you don't have to wait for the speakers to finish talking before you get your beers. It's really excellent. I am going to talk about discipline with our young sons and how to establish respectful dominion in our homes. When Rich and I were hashing out this title together, and we're going to really get it, it's good. It nails what we want to be talking about. But I was wary of it because it kind of sounds like a bad parenting self-help book that you would find at the airport. So I want to make a few clarifications here at the outset. Number one is that I am not a parenting expert. I don't think, I'll stand by this, I've said it before, I don't think there is any such thing as a parenting expert. I think the only person who would feel confidence to say they are a parenting expert is someone who is not a parent. I think that what I'm going to do tonight is not talk to you as a father of five. I'm going to talk to you, as Rich explained, as head of the lower school in the past 20 years or so of my career, interacting with wonderful, difficult 8, 9, and 10-year-olds, and great struggling parents like ourselves over those years. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of sets of different parents who are in the same game that we are of trying to raise good sons. So that experience is what I plan to bring to the table tonight. Secondly, that I'm not going to propose any formula because of how various our children are, how difficult and different the human soul is. I'm not going to give any sort of recipe, but rather I'm going to propose a few principles that we can hope to have them inform our smaller decisions throughout our parenting. And finally, that I am not planning on proposing a comprehensive list of these principles. These are a few. What I plan to do is I plan to share a few that we employ in the Valley. Obviously, we're not parenting, but we are teaching, we are establishing dominion in our classrooms, or trying to do so. And so what I would bring you in on today is just a little glimpse of how our teachers do that in the Valley. The impetus behind this too is that, broadly speaking, in our culture, I think there is a bit of a parenting metaphysical crisis in today's world. Who are we as parents? How do we parent? And there seems to be a real difficulty in establishing this dynamic of being respectful and also establishing authority. They almost seem at odds with each other. They can't be done together. And so what we have is this sort of polarization. It's the Von Trapp dichotomy, if you will, of the Captain Von Trapp with his whistle and real authoritarian order and scaring the kids into submission. And then on the other side is Maria, who comes in, and all you have to do is not worry about discipline, but just sing some nice songs, and the kids will be completely compliant to everything that you want to do. I'm sure the Von Trapps were lovely people in reality, but that's how Hollywood and Broadway, presented them. And both of those are unrealistic as far as what we want to do. On one hand, there's the totalitarian authoritarianism, and this is the rule of fear. And then on the other hand is the other extreme that we fall into of permissiveness, parenting of permissiveness. So if the one is ruling or teaching through fear, the other is teaching through placation, of just pleasing, constantly pleasing our children. So how do we find the balance? There was an article written by a Marine turned headmaster of a prominent prep school over a decade ago that I read when first taking on this job, and it was entitled Wimps and Barbarians. And it was talking about the difficulty of modern boy education, young education of young boys, and saying that our youth, our young lads, are turning into these very extreme versions. They're either very wimpy and not able to help themselves or fight for themselves, and then on the other hand are these sort of rugged, overly rugged, bullies. And we can see how the very authoritarian parenting leads to raising barbarians. These are either barbarians towards others and bullies, or barbarians towards themselves in being kind of bullied by their own anxiety. And then on the other hand, these wimps who are just given everything and they never have to fight, and they don't develop that resilience. What we're after in the end is going to be virtue. We're looking for how do we inculcate virtue in our sons. Aristotle defined virtue as the golden mean between extremes, between excess and deficiency. And again, kind of looking at these polar opposite or polar extremes of parenting, permissiveness is the deficiency of discipline, whereas authoritarianism is the excess of discipline. So where is the golden mean? That is what we are looking for. We're looking for what is discipline. After all, I might as well define our terms. I think that it's often misunderstood, discipline. You hear discipline, you think punishment. You think something hard, and there's good reason why it's sort of misunderstood in that way, because in Merriam-Webster it's defined, number 1 and number 2. The first definition is control gained by enforced obedience, and the second is punishment, noun. Whereas the Latin, if you go to the etymology of the word, disciplina is, number 1, instruction or knowledge given, or 2, teaching or learning. Those are very different definitions. And what we're going to be looking for today is how to accomplish the latter, and not just isolate it to punishments or forced control. I mean, discipline at the end of the day is how we teach. If you ask a Valley teacher what his best disciplinary tactic is, he'll say a good lesson plan. Because if we're teaching well, if we're keeping the boys engaged, it takes care of 90% of what boys might run into as disciplinary issues in other environments. But it's not just teaching in general. It's not just teaching math and language arts and literature. We are going to be teaching character. One of the founding minds behind the Heights is a teacher named Eddie Smith. We never taught on this campus. We taught on the DC campus. And he said that being a male is a biological characteristic, but being a man is a question of character. And being a man means having virtue. It means having the virtues of a man, what makes us to be men. So that's what we're after. We're after discipline of the will, discipline of the intellect. How do we form these men to be men of virtue? And let's also face it at the outset here that we have a big task in front of us. I mean, boys have a long way to go. They're a far way off from being the humans we hope they will be one day. I mean, when Christ said that, looking at the young, that heaven is inhabited by such as these, he wasn't talking about the fact they're caked with mud and they make fart sounds with their armpits. I mean, it was something different. I mean, the maturity level of a boy compared to where we hope they get to one day is a far cry. I mean, I think, we could all just readily admit that women are in general just more mature than men, but we should get some credit for the distance traveled. I mean, from where we came from, where we started was so far behind. And we get to witness this in our sons every day. Years ago, there were a couple of teachers in the Valley who built a cage, a large cage that they would put things for natural history. They would find raccoons or squirrels or rabbits in. They called it the Mammal Cage. And one day there was a visitor who shadowed that day, and when the teacher called them all back into the classroom, the visitor was nowhere to be found. And when the teacher asked the rest of the boys where he was, they simply looked at him and said, well, the lock got jammed. And the teacher said, "What do you mean?" "Yeah, he's in the mammal cage, and the lock got jammed, and we couldn't get him out." Now, two things are striking about this story. Number one, that the only thing they found wrong with this was that the lock got jammed. That's the only thing that went wrong. The second thing was that the boy who visited that day enrolled at the Heights the next year. So it was the greatest day of his life. Spent a day in the mammal cage. So, what we're dealing with, the matter of what we're dealing with, it's a tall task. And on the home front, thinking about our parenting, I mean, even when things are going well, it's a tough job. Parenting is difficult to do it well, and even when things are running swimmingly. The good news is that it is doable. Here at the Heights, we have 145 students right now in the lower school, and ages 8 through 10. And I have roughly 20 teachers who, in whatever period a day, in 8 different classrooms, are able to keep 15 to 20 of these boys in an environment of respectful dominion. So I'd like to just bring you in on some of the things that they do there. I'd like to talk about a few of the principles. I'm just going to talk about 3 different principles that we try to put into practice. I'm going to reference a virtue that I think is necessary for us to work on in that principle, and then try to give a couple of concrete practices or examples of how to use these principles in the day-to-day. So the first of these principles is to respect them as if they are men, but remember that they are just a boy. Remember that they are just boys. This is more of a mindset thing than an actual practice, but we have a lot of students who come in and transfer in from other schools, and as boys will, especially at co-ed schools, they'll be having some disciplinary issues there, and we'll see it either in the teacher recommendation forms, or we'll hear about it from the boys' parents when they come. And as a Heights student, there really isn't much of those disciplinary issues that we heard about. It's just the environmental change. And you could chalk that up to a number of different things. But I think one of the main things is, for the first time, they are being treated not as some small little peon. They are being respected as someone, maybe that they're not yet, but that they are envisioned to be. That makes a big difference. And a couple ways to do this. One is to avoid, what our teachers do, will avoid sort of condescending tone of voice or words towards the boys. That's one. The second is to not be scandalized when they mess up. And I think that a lot of times we do this backwards. We treat them like boys, and in the back of our minds have the expectations that they're going to actually act like men. And so we have these gross overreactions, and they know from the get-go that we don't really count on them fulfilling what we hope them to do. This is a mindset change, and part of it is just us raising them up to our level. I mean, I remember it when I transferred in 5th grade, this feeling, Mr. McCleary, he just, knowing now as I know 5th graders, he never could dream that I was actually going to be, what he projected to me that he thought I was. But I felt the change that year. This is exhibited in the way that we address the boys. We call them Mr. Smith, Mr. Kilner, Mr. their last name. And obviously that's not something that you're going to do at home, but we can say please when we ask them to do something. We can say thank you when they've done that. And we do that in the homerooms as well, to show them that we are respecting them and we're expecting them to do different things. One practice that homeroom teachers, or all teachers, I keep saying homeroom teachers, but all the teachers will avoid in the Valley is trying to command respect from a distance. Or, this often involves yelling. Two things are important: eye contact and proximity. And that in itself will just get them into the way that we address each other as adults. I mean, unless there's a microphone. But we stand close to each other and we look each other in the eye and we speak on the same level. They notice that. And that's an important thing. This takes humility. This is something that if we have the authoritarian mindset of, I am the adult and I know best, even in the back of our minds, that will come through in our words. It'll come through in the teacher's words. There's a great scene from To Kill a Mockingbird, and that, in my mind, is a great fictional parenting book, because Atticus Finch is a fantastic model for parenting in my mind, where he's talking to his brother, Uncle Jack, Scout's uncle. And there had just been a scene where Scout had gotten a fight, and he had disciplined her, the uncle had disciplined her, roughly, yelling and spanking. And later on, he's talking with Atticus about, how is it that you've never laid a hand on her? I never heard you raise your voice. And there's lots to it. It's a great little passage. But the key line is he says, she knows, I know, she tries. She knows, I know, she tries. Do our students know that we know that they are trying? And part of that is us respecting them and showing them in our words. Humility. This is going to take some humility to exhibit that. The few teachers who have struggled in this area of kind of establishing discipline, they've been ones who have been nervous about it and really anxious to establish it and really worried that they weren't getting it across. Humility to just understand this is my office, and I have been given this authority. Jim Stenson talks about having unanxious leadership, and that goes a long way. So to have this confident conviction that we have the grace of state as parents, as teachers, just by very nature of the office that we have the authority, and to rest in that. So 2 concrete points there on respecting them like men and remembering that they're just boys, which speaks to putting them on our level. Number 1, 2 things, these are 2 things that Valley teachers will not say. Number 1, because I said so. Because I said so might be the truth. But what it does, and what it does in the ears of the boy, is immediately create that chasm of difference between who's talking to me and who I am. And we've just severed that connection of personability, of connection. Sometimes we do not need to explain ourselves. I don't need a big, long explanation from my teachers, and that we would never be able to get through a class if we did that. But sometimes, it is a quick explanation, or, no, I told you to do this, and that's what's going to happen. Secondly, Valley teachers do not begin sentences with if. Because if we begin sentences with if when correcting or disciplining a student, you are banking all of your authority on a threat or a bribe. It's a conditional clause that's going to lead to or else. And what that is doing, again, subconsciously in the mind of the boy, is, okay, your authority is not really coming from you. It's coming from this external thing that you're either going to hold out in front of me to chase, or you're going to put on top of me as some sort of punishment. So the dominion is the result of, when parents ask me, how do you do discipline? Well, a lot of it is that the boys at the Heights are just so eager to please their teachers. Now, that's not always the case with us on the home front, but we lose that connection. We can try to regain it when we use conditional clauses too much. The second principle is to grant freedom by establishing boundaries. Chesterton has this great image that he goes into, I think it's in Orthodoxy, of, classic Chesterton, this ridiculous hypothetical of putting children up on top of a mountaintop. And so you give them a ball, and what would they do? They'd huddle together and do nothing because they would be afraid to fall off the mountain. But if you build up a wall around them, well, then they'd be throwing the ball because they wouldn't be afraid of losing the ball, and they wouldn't be afraid of falling off the mountain. He says that we need to give room for good things to run wild. The first thing that my teachers do on the first day of school is they go on a walk with their homeroom, and they show them the boundaries of the valley, which is pretty expansive, and it's about 6 acres. So they show them where it extends to, the very spot. It's this down tree, it's this line of grass, and within that, it's yours. They need that, not just so that we can let them be free. I mean, it's not a freedom for freedom's sake. It's a freedom so that they can do good. It's a freedom so that they can exercise their will. We tend to get into these dynamics with our students or our children that tends to be like this battle of wills. And that is a result of, instead of giving boundaries and establishing healthy parameters, trying to build them up brick by brick, as if we're constructing this child. And I just need to be there to show him every step of the way by rule and rule and rule what needs to happen, rather than understanding at the outset, this thing in front of me, this wild, maniacal thing is good. And he's going to do good things. He's going to do some bad things, but he's not bad that every once in a while will do a good thing. He's a good thing that will every once in a while do a bad thing. And that's a slight difference. It's a huge difference. And to know that if I can just give him some room to roam, and he knows the boundaries, that will allow him to use his will in the right way. Joe McPherson, who is one of the previous headmasters of the school back in the 80s and 90s, used to say, show me a boy with too many rules and I'll show you an angry boy. Show me a boy with too few rules and I'll show you a sad boy. There's that balance, that dynamic. In the Valley, we do have rules. They're pretty basic common sense rules. We don't have thousands of rules. We don't have rules pasted up everywhere. We don't have rules that we're constantly reminding them of. Why? Because we have an internal rule. We have natural law within us that we're trying to direct them to. And we're trying to engage their will to find them and to choose the good. If we make this dynamic with our students a battle of wills, we'll never give them the space to actually develop their will. And so that's a principle that we really try to foster in the Valley. This will require the virtue of prudence. Prudence to decide when, where's the line? What battle do I pick? What brush fire do I need to put out now so it doesn't become a forest fire? The particulars, the practical conscience of making those calls are myriad, and there are, all throughout the day for us teachers and parents. And these scenarios can be really complicated. Luckily, boys are not, they don't see the complicated side of life, and it's sometimes easy for us to point these things out, but they don't really see life in its nuanced reality. I remember telling a story, it was September 11th a few years ago, and I was telling the class, as a class of third graders, about 9/11, and, without getting into all the details, telling them that there was these men who were maliciously hijacked planes, and, they did these awful things, and we really got to pray for them, and I see this one boy, and I can see his eyes just filling with rage. And after I had finished my story, he slams on the desk and goes, "Ugh, Nazis." Because anybody who's ever done anything evil in history is a Nazi. So was his logic. They see things in very clear shades, and there's not much gray there. We need to inject our prudence into their life. I was in 5th grade when, again, Mr. McCleary was my homeroom teacher, and I remember a time when I had a dynamic with one of my classmates who was, I always he was always ragging on me, and I was new that year, and he was sort of the sporty, powerful one in the class, and I remember one time it got to be too much, and it was one straw too many, and in class he kind of said something under his breath, and I just exploded with something that I would not repeat here, and for all to hear, and Mr. McCleary slowly asked me to leave the room, and he came out and talked to me very calmly, and he said, I had to ask you to leave because you can't say something like that in front of everybody else. But I'm so glad that you finally stood up for yourself. And next time, don't let it wait so long and it won't be such an explosion. I was 10 years old. I still remember those words. That was a prudent correction because he saw that the whole thing wasn't bad. The way in which I communicated it was bad. But boys don't see those nuances. When I went out, I thought I was dead. I thought life was over. My mom and dad were going to kill me. And the whole thing, I had just ruined my entire life. It was all bad. And he was able to help me see through that. So prudence is really necessary. It's so helpful for us teachers and parents. Concretely, I think one thing we can do is we can help them set boundaries by defining the non-negotiables, by giving them healthy options. Mom, I don't want to do my homework. Well, here's our schedule for tonight. You've got a window at 5, you've got a window at 7. Which would you like to do it at? Parentheses, because not doing your homework is not an option, right? And you didn't even need to say that. You gave other options. There's ways in which, as teachers, we want to give freedom to make choices, again, engaging their will, to have say, this especially works for headstrong children, over something. If we just say, nope, it's my way or the highway, you got to have this way, well, you might try to give them an option in some way, give them some say over it. The second is to establish a culture of principles. I know that doesn't sound very concrete. Let me get around to it. I read a book a few years ago about the greatest coaches in history, different sports, and this journalist had interviewed a number of these coaches, some of the most successful coaches in recent history. He was trying to find one thread that ran through all of them, one characteristic that they all exhibited. And there wasn't really anything tangible except for the fact that each of them had a set of principles that they stuck to, that they did not bend on, and that every player in the locker room knew was part of the culture of that team. And it was different principles for different coaches, but they were universal for that team. Everyone knew it, and it was inflexible. What's the culture of our classroom? Do our students know it? What's the culture of our home? There was a boy who was shadowing one day, and more recently, and they were playing football out on the wood chips, and the boys take a lot of pride in the way they tackle properly, because that's one of the things the teachers will coach them on early in the year, is how to tackle the right way. And this visitor, who was kind of having a hard time getting involved, he kind of just stuck his leg out to trip somebody to tackle him. And there was just this stillness around the field, and everyone stared at him. And one of the bigger boys finally stepped out and just looked at him and said, "Dude, we don't do that here." That's culture, right? I mean, there's something that, that they knew. The third principle is to rely on natural consequences. So if we have held them to high standards, we've given them this freedom with boundaries, What do we do when they transgress? Because they will transgress. First, again, I'm going to start with a mindset. We want them to transgress. It would not be healthy if we set boundaries and our children never broke them. That would be some indication of a lacking in some way, some fear or anxiety that our sons are not adventuring, they're not experiencing as much as they can and finding where those natural boundaries are. I tell my soccer players on the varsity soccer team, if you haven't committed a foul in a couple games, you're not playing hard enough. I don't want you to be dirty, but if you have not been called for a foul, something's wrong. So we've got to go get them to that line so that they can experience it themselves. There's virtue there that might be missing in the gap. It's a very hackneyed psychological idea these days of the growth mindset, but it's a true idea. We want them to be failing in little ways. We especially want them to be failing at 8, 9, 10. The more they fail at 8, 9, 10, the less they fail at 18, 19, 20. And that is true. But again, that's where the prudence comes in, is where do we set the boundaries? Two difficulties here. The first is our own fight with our own anger when they transgress, when they do something contrary to our wishes, when they do something disobedient. And here, we get into the category of parenting principles that are simple but not easy. Right? I would love to tell you that my Valley teachers, they never lose their temper, right? 145 boys, 8, 9, 10. If I were to tell you that they never lose their temper, you would think that, they were cyborgs. It is impossible. So let's all take ourselves, let ourselves off the hook a little bit here. But are we struggling with it? Are we trying to fight the good fight there? The second difficulty is fighting the impulse to think that when they do this, they need to suffer in some way. That in some way they need to suffer in order to, or we need to make them suffer in order to, right the wrong. What they need to do is they need to learn. That is what we want from them in the moment. The accident, the mistake, the transgression, that's not the important part. It's what happens afterwards. It's a huge opportunity. So we teachers in the Valley look for those as opportunities. We're hungry for those. And if we can be there for them, great. A lot of times they'll learn from them without us being there. Most of the time they'll learn without us being there. But if we can be there, great. Because that moment is really important. Because what we're doing is we're trying to point out what is the consequence of their choice. And I teach 17-year-olds moral theology. They're still coming to grips with the idea that choices have consequences, that decisions, they change what happens to you and your surrounding environment and your relationships. Still coming to grips with that. But in the lower school, at this age, they're a sponge for that type of lesson. That when they make a mistake, we're trying to point them and teach them about the reality of what happens, what comes next. And anger and arbitrary punishments tend to distract from that lesson. There's a place for anger, there's a place for punishments, but we have to use them again prudently. This is going to bring us to the most important virtue, not just for parenting, but laid out by our Lord, which is that of charity. Chesterton, again, quoting the namesake of this room, said that to love is to love something that is unlovable. We all love our children, right? And certainly in the abstract, we love our children. But what about in that moment that he is being his most difficult self? Are we loving him right then and there? Because love is not this nebulous, floaty word. It's an action. Are you loving him in that moment? That's what we've got to pray about. That's what we've got to work for. Because to discipline a boy should never mean to discourage a boy. We're in the business in the valley of encouraging them, and that is different than placating them. We don't need to just make them feel good about themselves. That's different from encouragement, right? I did not plant that example that Rich used in the introduction, but if you think about the way that we handle our children when they were toddlers, when they're running down the sidewalk and trip and they scrape or cut their knee, we don't go over there and say, hey, what were you doing? Look at what happens when skin hits concrete. This is the result of not running properly, right? Don't do this again. We pick them up. We make them feel very quickly that they're taken care of, and then we pat them on the butt and send them on their way. As 8, 9, 10-year-olds, there's a version of that they still need in the same exact way with, bigger things, not just when they fall and scrape their knee, but when they make some type of moral transgression, right? It's the same thing. It is often going to be let the natural consequence play out or point them towards that natural consequence. Yeah, we give you 6 acres of valley to play in. But you broke the boundary back there, so now your valley, your personal valley, just got smaller until you can prove to us again that we can trust you with the bigger valley. Natural consequences. Here's, getting back to charity, the idea that what we say and what we instill in them does so much. There's an example from the Odyssey where Telemachus, who's Odysseus' son, you remember he's this whiny character at the beginning of the book, moping that his house is being ransacked and that he doesn't have a father, and he's basically just complaining. And then we go a full 20 chapters or so, and he's referred to as a boy the whole book until chapter 16 or 17 or so, when he meets Odysseus, and Odysseus says, "You are a good man." And from then on, he's referred to as a man. And in the subsequent chapters after that, he becomes this character that's unrecognizable from the beginning of the book, and he goes and helps his dad do heroic things and is a powerful, confident young man. St. Augustine said, "Love and do what you will." Parenting does seem complicated sometimes, but if we can strive for charity and love, again, not just in the abstract, but in the concrete moment, love and do what you will doesn't mean you can't do anything wrong. It just means love and parent how seems best to you in that moment. And if you're guided and informed by love, something good's going to happen. A couple concretes on this principle to wrap up. Our teachers try not to correct in the moment, number one, because they'd never get through a lesson if we were correcting every single thing that we sensed. It's not that we're oblivious to it. It's not that we don't see it. It's not that we don't hear it. It's that we can't stop every single time. Sometimes we just got to keep moving on. Sometimes we just go stand next to the boy and teach right next to him rather than correct him. We got to keep the train moving. And sometimes our children need that at home. Sometimes they get too much attention from us. Second, engage them in seeing the consequence. This is not going to work every time, but, one thing that my teachers will do is they'll say, what do you think should be the result of this? Help them see it before just telling it to them. This is all sort of under the umbrella of don't overteach, don't overparent. Be careful with our words, mind our words. Sometimes we let them come out too fast and too quickly. And third, and maybe most difficultly, is to apologize. I think the best parenting lesson I ever received was from my mom, who time and again, growing up, I can remember apologizing to me. And she's a great mom, great parent. And that taught me so much that it always reminded me, and I see it more clearly now than I guess then, but emotionally I saw it then, that what just happened when she blew her top at me, that's not the important thing. The important thing is that she loves me, that she's got me. And it brings them back to that reality, and it provides the context for them. Tom Royals, who's the assistant headmaster here and sort of dean of discipline, if you will, de facto, I've heard him saying this to students, I'm sorry, the matter was right, but the manner was wrong. And, there are alums in the crowd today who say, no one would doubt the dominion of Tom Royals here at the school, but it's respectful because he apologized. And that goes a long way. It keeps the personal connection there. So in closing, I said at the beginning that there's no such thing as a parenting expert, but that's not entirely true because you are your son's parenting expert. You're the parenting expert for you and for your son. There's a proverb that says, when you teach your son, you're teaching your son's son. We're not just teaching boys to be good boys. We're not just teaching boys to be good men. We're teaching boys to be good fathers. We're teaching boys to be good leaders. And each of them are so different. And only you know them the way you know them. And so if we trust our instincts and we go about raising them with conviction and with charity, we're going to have far fewer wimps and barbarians in the world and far more good men. Thank you.